This video continues our discussion of the Septuagint, and we'll go on to talk about some other versions. The Septuagint dates to before 200 BC into the 100s BC, depending on which particular book of the Old Testament we're talking about. According to folklore in the letter of Aristenaetus, the Septuagint is ascribed to 72 scribes, 6 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, that were brought together to translate the Septuagint. And so 6 times 12, 72, that came to be abbreviated in Latin Roman numerals LXX, which is 50, 10, 10, which is 70 in Roman numerals. And according to that folklore, it was a miracle when they translated the Pentateuch, because they all got together after doing things independently, and miraculously all the translations agreed. And I would have to tell you, having been a translator myself, that for a bunch of translators to come up with identically the same reading would indeed be a miracle. The Septuagint became the Old Testament Bible of the early Greek-speaking church. Augustine considered it more important than the Hebrew text. In fact, he was upset when the scholar Jerome chose to translate the Latin Vulgate from the Hebrew rather than the Greek for the Old Testament. And it's still the official Greek Old Testament translation for the Greek Orthodox Church. Well, what's the Septuagint good for? Well, it's useful for textual criticism of the Old Testament. Now, the Septuagint differs more from the Masoretic text than does the Samaritan from the Masoretic text. One radical case is the Greek of Jeremiah is about 1/8 shorter than the Masoretic text. A very different text. The translator of the Septuagint for Jeremiah had as compared with the Masoretic tradition. We'll say more about that later. But it's also useful because it's the source of most New Testament quotations of the Old Testament. One place where this happens is in Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 9, and it's kind of an interesting example because the writer of Hebrews chose a Greek version that differs from the Hebrew. The Hebrews 8 and verse 9 says in Greek something that means I did not care for them, a melesa, whereas the Hebrew says, I was a husband to them, baalti. And the difference may be this, that the Greek melesa perhaps reflects a Hebrew variation, not baalti, I was a husband, but rather gaalti with a G, I loathed them. And so one letter difference in Hebrew makes the difference between what the Septuagint translation has and the Masoretic text has, and that reflects a variation there. Another case is in Psalm 8 and verse 5, quoted by Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 7. In the Septuagint, as quoted by the book of Hebrews, it speaks of how God made man little lower than the angels, whereas the Masoretic text reads God made man little lower than God. The Septuagint reads angeloi, whereas the Masoretic text reads Elohim, the Hebrew word for God. Now, in this particular case, the Septuagint is giving an interpretation of the Hebrew Elohim interpreting God there as actually not God capital G, but as gods in the sense of angels rather than God himself. In this case, there's not a different Hebrew text. It represents an interpretation of the same Hebrew text. Now, this might raise the question of, well, doesn't this undermine the reliability and authority of the New Testament, that it is quoting at some points what might be arguably faulty Septuagint translations? And I would say this generally, like preachers today, the New Testament can quote a commonly used translation without the need to fix all the translation errors along the way. If they're quoting it and the quote in the version is not in error, then it's okay to quote it, even if it may not be the most accurate translation of things. And so long as what the Septuagint said is actually true, then one can use its imprecise renderings without contradicting the idea that Scripture is inerrant in this regard. So, in my view, the Septuagint probably did not correctly translate Psalm 8 and verse 5, that what it says is that God made man little lower than God. They translate it little more than the angels, but it is true that God made humans a little lower than the angels, as the Septuagint says. And so it's not an incorrect thing that the writer of Hebrews is quoting at that point. Limitations on using the Septuagint for textual criticism are among these. It's not as if you're comparing apples to apples. In order to figure out the Hebrew text on which the Septuagint was based, you have to take the Greek and retranslate it back into Hebrew. But the problem is that the Septuagint sometimes paraphrases the Hebrew rather than giving a different text. Moreover, the Septuagint has its own complicated textual history. The Septuagint is not a single text as handed down. There are major variations within Septuagint manuscripts. So you have to do text criticism of the Septuagint before you can use the Septuagint to do text criticism of the Hebrew Bible. Well, let's talk about some other Greek versions. Another Greek version is the version of Aquila, translated around AD 130 for the Old Testament. Aquila seems to have been a Jewish proselyte who didn't like the Septuagint because it lends itself to Christian messianic interpretation. In other words, he had converted to Judaism, but he was not a Christian. The Aquila translation is very literal, is very word for wordish. It survives in what is called the Hexapla, which we'll mention here in a moment. And there's some Aquila readings in the Chirogeniza fragments that we mentioned in a earlier video. Here's a copy of that's in the Cambridge collection from the Chirogeniza of an Aquila translation, although it turns out that what they did, they reused the paper and wrote over the Aquila translation with another text, but they're able, scholars are, to reconstruct the Aquila reading underneath what was written over it. Another Greek version is Theodosian translation of the 2nd century AD. And again, church tradition suggests that he was a Jewish proselyte and that it was popular among Christians. It was perhaps a revision of an earlier Greek translation, and thus there were Theodosian readings in even the New Testament quotes of the Old. But anyway, Theodosian of Daniel is probably the best version of it, although there's some people that doubt that Theodosian did this one. It's a long story there. But it survives in Hexapla fragments and in the Septuagint manuscripts of Daniel. We will continue our discussion of the versions in the next video.